Good afternoon, New York, and the rest of our listeners around the globe. My name is June Stoyer, and I'm the host of the Organic View radio show. Our podcast is available on iTunes, Zune, and you can also visit our website at www.theorganicview.com. If you have any questions for our guests, there are many ways you can contact the show. You can post a question on our wall on Facebook, Skype us, send us a tweet on Twitter to @TheOrganicView, or you can contact me directly at June Stoyer. If you'd like to be on the show or would like to find out about sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at questions@theorganicview.com. In this special series called the Neonicotinoid View, my guest co-host Tom Theobald and I will be joined by attorney Mr. Peter Jenkins from the Center for Food Safety, who will talk about the lawsuit against the EPA over bee toxic pesticides. So I would first like to welcome to the show my special co-host, Tom Theobald. Good afternoon, Tom.
Hello, June.
And our guest today, Mr. Peter T. Jenkins. Good afternoon, Mr. Jenkins, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Mr. Jenkins, if you could share with our audience a little bit about yourself, and then if you can also talk about the background of the Center for Food Safety.
I'd be happy to. And first let me say thank you for your efforts, June, and for Tom in putting on these shows. They've been very educational for me and for others who are interested in this area, because there's so much science and so much new information coming in, and you have channeled it to the public and to us, so thanks for that. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about myself. I'm an environmental lawyer and policy analyst. I've been working in the environmental area for, 30 years now. It's hard to believe, but time flies when you're having fun, I guess. I'm originally from Seattle, grew up loving the Northwest and the mountains and getting out hiking, and knew I wanted to do things for the environment, and fell into the environmental law world out there, practiced law for several years, and then decided I really wanted to work more in the policy arena. After having practiced law for 5 years, I went back to school for a year at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and I got a master's in environmental studies to learn a little bit more formally about the policy arena and economics, as well as the scientific aspects of these issues. And since then, for about the last 22 years, I have worked in a number of NGOs and government offices, both in D.C. and also I spent 8 years in New Mexico working on conservation issues there. I've been back in D.C. for the last 12 years and sort of jumped around a bit. I spent 5 very good years from 2001 to 2006 here at the Center for Food Safety doing environmental litigation, mostly related to GMOs, but also to other issues as well.
Thank you so much. Very interesting background, if I do say so myself. Mr. Jenkins, could you please share with our audience the background for the lawsuit? Can you also tell us who is involved and how are they impacted?
I'd be glad to, and let me just put in a plug for the Center for Food Safety, because, as I said, I worked here from 2001 to 2006. Now I'm back here. I've been back here for the last 15 months or so. Center for Food Safety is an NGO based in D.C. that has an office here near the Capitol, but also we have an office in San Francisco and now one in Portland, Oregon. And we're dedicated to exploring what are the impacts of new technologies that deal with food and agriculture, and how they're impacting the environment, how they're impacting human health and safety, and the nutrition of food. So we deal a lot with issues like genetic modification. We've dealt with food irradiation, food safety issues generally, and now we're doing more on pesticides and the role of pesticides in food safety as well as environmental health issues.
Well, I think it's all tied in together, so it makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, obviously the food supply is a huge part of everyone's life in this country, and it's a great focus area for this group to work on. It's been around for about 15 years, and we collaborate with tons and tons of other NGOs that are like-minded, both in the environmental world and in the consumer world. So we sort of sit in the middle between the consumer and environmental organization. But you asked about the lawsuit. I'm happy to talk about the lawsuit, which was filed a week ago in Federal District Court in San Francisco. The lawsuit has a number of parties, and I could sort of run through the list. One of the parties is the Center for Food Safety, and we're also the legal representatives for the group. We have a legal department. I'm one of the attorneys, but we have 3 other attorneys based in San Francisco and Portland, Oregon, doing a lot of the legwork on the legal side. And then in terms of the other parties, the most important parties really are the beekeepers, one of whom is on this show, Tom Theobald. And we have 3 other commercial beekeepers, Steve Ellis from Minnesota and California, Bill Rhodes from Florida, and also Jim Doan from New York State. So what's cool about those beekeepers, besides they're all being great guys, is that they provide good geographic representation, and I think are indicative and representative of this critical agricultural sector in terms of their operations and where they live and what they do and sort of the impacts that they felt. So they're the key plaintiffs, in that they're the most directly impacted commercially and in other ways personally they're impacted. But then we also have several consumer and environmental groups in as plaintiffs as well. Beyond Pesticides, which is a great group that focuses on pesticide issues and getting our nation aimed at alternatives to pesticides and organic approaches instead of this chemical treadmill that we're on. The group called Pesticide Action Network North America, which is PANA, based in San Francisco. Obviously, they are similarly focused on pesticides. They are an international network. PANA has international partners around the world, so we can connect in through PANA to some of what's going on with neonics around the world. And then we have the Sierra Club, the country's biggest environmental organization, in some ways the most important environmental organization in the country because they have offices in practically every state, and they're committed to it. And then a group called the Center for Environmental Health, which is based in San Francisco, and it's sort of like Center for Food Safety. They focus quite a bit on the impacts of pesticides on the environment and on human health.
Thank you.
Mr. Jenkins, there are several main challenges raised by the suit. Could you describe those for the listeners and explain why they're so important?
Well, the suit, Tom, developed out of a petition that we filed about a year ago, and you were also on that petition. We also had 24 other beekeepers or beekeeper organizations on that petition, as well as several NGOs. That petition a year ago we filed with EPA seeking suspension of clothianidin. We sort of took clothianidin, one of the key neonicotinoid pesticides at issue here, as sort of our lead chemical, and said we laid out the case why clothianidin was so risky and why it was an immediate hazard and should be suspended. We filed that in the way of a formal petition to the agency seeking that sort of relief. And that was effectively denied by the agency a few months after we filed that. Well, we waited a year to get a complete answer, and we never got a complete answer from EPA, except for this sort of partial denial saying they didn't think it was an emergency. During the passage of that year, since we filed that petition, so much more new information came to a head, new scientific information that justified a real confrontation with EPA, and that's what the lawsuit represents. We're really saying that EPA, you've really blown it here. The lawsuit is not about damages. It's not about money for anybody. It's about getting EPA to recognize that it has to follow the law. It has to follow its own laws and regulations, and so that's what the lawsuit is really about, that it hasn't complied with FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act, nor has EPA complied with its own regulations that lay out a number of steps that the agency has to do, which, frankly, it just hasn't done in this case. I'd be glad to describe those in a bit more detail if you want.
Sure, that would be great.
Maybe a little bit more about conditional registrations. What's the climate there?
That's the gist of the case, isn't it? The problem is that Congress did include in FIFRA a little section called conditional registration, which allows, in special circumstances, it allows EPA to approve pesticides to be marketed even though they haven't fully qualified by providing all of the scientific information that's needed to show that they're really safe. And it's a backwards process, but it's one that EPA has used repeatedly to allow pesticides onto the market that really we don't know enough about. So that's the gist of our lawsuit, that EPA has abused that provision. And how have they abused it? Well, as far as the neonicotinoids go, EPA imposed some conditions on the initial registrations of clothianidin and thiamethoxam, which are the two big compounds in the lawsuit. And when those conditions were imposed on the companies, such as Bayer and Syngenta and others, to provide information to satisfy some of the unknowns and uncertainties that EPA had about these pesticides, what's happened is that EPA has not followed up with its own conditions. EPA has not held the company's feet to the fire and made them actually follow through in providing that information. So there's a number of key information gaps, and I can't even list them all here, but the main one that beekeepers, of course, are interested in, and we're interested in, is the fact that one of the conditions imposed in 2003 on clothianidin was that there needed to be an adequate pollinator field test. That is a true study published in a journal that showed what the impacts on pollinators were, such as honeybees, from the use of clothianidin. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because everybody knows insecticides are going to kill honeybees if they're exposed to enough of them, so we really need to know what the extent of the impact is. Well, it turns out, as the audience has probably heard from hearing you, Tom, and others, and it's pretty well known now that basically it is now 2013, and 10 years after that condition was imposed on Bayer to provide impact study as far as pollinators and honeybees and the impact of clothianidin, we still don't have that study in hand, and not an adequate one. They did try a study up in Canada in canola that was roundly criticized and determined to be inadequate by the agency in 2010. And here's 3 years later, and they still haven't provided a study that replaces it. So 10 years after clothianidin was approved by EPA and it has been marketed all over the country, they still don't have that one key condition describing what the impacts on honeybees are. That the condition is not satisfied. It's outrageous. So, again, EPA hasn't followed its own rules and regulations, making sure that these pesticides are safe. That's what it boils down to.
Hasn't the EPA said something to the effect that they're aggressively trying to solve these bee problems, and yet it's my understanding that they don't plan to visit this question until 2018. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, that seems to be, unfortunately, EPA's line is that they're saying that they have accelerated the review of these pesticides. That's their words, accelerated. Our understanding, after asking them that question a few weeks ago before we filed the lawsuit in some public meetings, we asked them directly of EPA officials. We said, well, what do you mean by accelerated? Well, basically what they meant was that they weren't going to complete the review until probably 2020 or later, but now they've accelerated that review date for really looking at these pesticides again more completely. They've accelerated it up to 2018. But then I just saw a quote from Stephen Bradbury, an EPA official, saying, well, it could be 5 or 7 years from now. So it might be 2018, it might be 2020. Anyway, the point is...
Who is Stephen Bradbury?
He's the I think he's the director of the pesticide division. I don't have his exact title in front of me, but he's one of the lead EPA officials.
He's top management, though.
Top management, EPA officials in charge of the division there. He is the director of the Office of Pesticide Programs at EPA, and he's the lead defendant in our lawsuit. So I believe it was Stephen who was quoted as saying that it could be 5 to 7 years before they complete their registration review for clothianidin and thiamethoxam. Obviously, that's not soon enough given the risks that have been presented, so we can't sit around and wait for 5 or 7 years for EPA to decide just how risky these things are. We need some answers now.
Mr. Jenkins, is there a general time frame by which the agrochemical companies typically provide that information to the EPA?
So that's a good question, and it's sort of reflected in our lawsuit. If you read through the complaint, we talk about that because the EPA's own guidelines say that there's a limited time period to provide the studies to satisfy the conditions on these conditional registrations. Well, what does that mean? Well, it turns out that in a few cases they actually put a year on them. For some of the studies that were imposed, they were supposed to provide the results back within 2 or 3 years of the initial registration. So, for example, with clothianidin, it might have been by 2006 that these various studies were supposed to have been provided, or with thiamethoxam as early as 2002 that one of the studies, I believe, was supposed to have been provided. And I'm not remembering the exact dates right now, but the point is that EPA did impose deadlines on the companies to provide the information in some cases, and yet the agency has allowed the companies to slip through those deadlines and has continually accepted delays for a whole host of reasons, mostly because the companies come in and complain that they can't do the studies for various reasons. And the impact is that 10 years, even 11 years after some of these conditions were imposed, they still haven't been complied with. So we don't think that's acceptable. We think that any reasonable person would agree that trying to allow a company to go on for 10 or 11 years after a condition has been imposed that is necessary to show the safety of an insecticide, it's just, it's outrageous is what it is.
And this is in the face of a growing body of science that shows that these chemicals are extremely damaging. Isn't that true?
Of course, that's a big part of it. We have to try to convince EPA, both in this litigation, but also in other avenues. And so, we don't want to just focus on the litigation. We have tried over the last couple years, Tom, as you know, and others, to convince EPA that the science is against them. They keep claiming that the science is uncertain, the science is unclear, and they just can't make a decision about these pesticides because there's too much uncertainty. Well, there's just been a massive amount of new information that has come out from respected academic researchers published in peer-reviewed journals showing that these pesticides used at field levels, at field-relevant levels, these are not like spiked super high levels, but these scientists are attempting to test these pesticides at relevant levels, and they're impacting honeybees, they're impacting bumblebees, they're impacting aquatic invertebrates, and we're very concerned about broader impacts going beyond bees, of course, too.
Thank you. Could you share with our audience your knowledge as to whether or not the EPA has been sued previously on similar grounds?
It has. EPA has been sued repeatedly over the years on a variety of comparable sort of cases, and often it is lost because of a failure to comply with basic laws like the Endangered Species Act and even with its own laws about publishing notices in the Federal Register. So there are precedents out there for EPA being sued and losing these sorts of cases. We think that our case is going to fit within those sorts of precedents. I should talk about the Endangered Species Act for a minute because we've talked a lot about the conditional registration and the sort of violations of FIFRA. And I mentioned the fact that a number of us are very concerned about the impacts of neonicotinoids on ecosystems. And that's where the Endangered Species Act gets invoked, because federal agencies are required by the Endangered Species Act to take very strong measures to protect federally listed threatened and endangered species from impacts of insecticides and other actions like that. EPA hasn't taken any of those steps. So we think they're very vulnerable on that claim because we know, having looked at the records, that EPA hasn't done the required analysis. They haven't consulted with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They haven't done anything to protect our threatened and endangered species. Now, the new report that came out recently, just 2 weeks ago, from the American Bird Conservancy that talks very clearly about EPA's failures to do analysis of the impacts of neonicotinoids on birds is a really important part of this argument, because there are many threatened and endangered birds that could be impacted by neonicotinoids and probably are being impacted by neonicotinoids right now. And to me, the most important and exciting thing about that report, in a way, was was its discussion of the impacts on water quality and aquatic invertebrates, because there you're talking about where these neonicotinoids are sterilizing, huge chunks of our ecosystems, so that surface waters and groundwaters and so on that are impacted by these substances that run off from these ag fields are becoming sterilized, and so the whole food chain is at risk, and that clearly is a threat to species, including threatened and endangered species that rely on those food chains.
I'm glad you touched upon the water question, because I wanted to ask a question about that.
Mm-hmm.
These compounds are water soluble and migrate with the groundwater, and yet just recently the EPA has approved clothianidin as a seed treatment on rice, if you can believe it, and the California Department of Agriculture is about to approve the aerial application of clothianidin on rice.
Yeah.
This seems like an extreme risk. Are you aware of those?
Yeah, we signed on. The Center for Food Safety signed on to some formal public comments that were submitted through Earth Justice, along with a couple of other NGOs, to the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, objecting to what they're doing with rice and clothianidin. And it's a bit ironic because it's from California that some of the best water quality studies have been done, showing that imidacloprid and some of the other insecticides are being found already at high levels in California water samples. And those samples are taken, across the state in a whole bunch of different agricultural settings through various sample locations that they have set up. So why they would allow another obvious risk, especially in view of the American Bird Conservancy report that pointed out that our current standards in the U.S. are too weak as far as protecting water quality from these things, and that really we're putting our whole aquatic ecosystems at risk by allowing this sort of contamination. It's a real concern, Tom.
Thank you. From a legal perspective, what are the implications of the environmental impacts of these systemic pesticides, the neonicotinoids? What is the legal perspective?
Well, I think I've touched on a lot of the points already, but what is sort of EPA's standard? EPA can't allow pesticides onto the market that have unreasonable adverse effects. So from a legal perspective, we're, of course, going to try to demonstrate that there's a whole huge amount of information about unreasonable adverse effects on the environment. That's very important. And I've just talked about the water quality and endangered species impacts, and those are very important from a legal perspective because we do have some powerful environmental laws in this country that don't allow agencies to just go out and damage the environment to an unreasonable level. So we need to, convince the judge that that's basically what's happening. But those are very important parts of our lawsuit. I would say that actually most of our lawsuit is not really so much based on scientific effects, but more on procedural problems that EPA has committed, and sort of EPA's being hoisted on its own petard in the sense that they have not complied with their own laws and regulations. So those procedural claims are very, very important too. But again, it does sort of invoke this question of whether there are unreasonable adverse effects.
Mr. Jenkins, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been really wonderful having you on the show, especially to explain to our audience from a legal perspective exactly what's involved with the lawsuit, as well as the work that the Center for Food Safety continues to do. It's just such a wonderful organization, and once again, such a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Yes,
my pleasure. Thanks for having me, both of you.
And folks, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been June Stoyer with the Organic View Radio Show. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, New York, and the rest of our listeners around the globe. My name is June Stoyer, and I'm the host of the Organic View radio show. Our podcast is available on iTunes, Zune, and you can also visit our website at www.theorganicview.com. If you have any questions for our guests, there are many ways you can contact the show. You can post a question on our wall on Facebook, Skype us, send us a tweet on Twitter to @TheOrganicView, or you can contact me directly at June Stoyer. If you'd like to be on the show or would like to find out about sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at questions@theorganicview.com. In this special series called the Neonicotinoid View, my guest co-host Tom Theobald and I will be joined by attorney Mr. Peter Jenkins from the Center for Food Safety, who will talk about the lawsuit against the EPA over bee toxic pesticides. So I would first like to welcome to the show my special co-host, Tom Theobald. Good afternoon, Tom.
Hello, June.
And our guest today, Mr. Peter T. Jenkins. Good afternoon, Mr. Jenkins, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Mr. Jenkins, if you could share with our audience a little bit about yourself, and then if you can also talk about the background of the Center for Food Safety.
I'd be happy to. And first let me say thank you for your efforts, June, and for Tom in putting on these shows. They've been very educational for me and for others who are interested in this area, because there's so much science and so much new information coming in, and you have channeled it to the public and to us, so thanks for that. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about myself. I'm an environmental lawyer and policy analyst. I've been working in the environmental area for, 30 years now. It's hard to believe, but time flies when you're having fun, I guess. I'm originally from Seattle, grew up loving the Northwest and the mountains and getting out hiking, and knew I wanted to do things for the environment, and fell into the environmental law world out there, practiced law for several years, and then decided I really wanted to work more in the policy arena. After having practiced law for 5 years, I went back to school for a year at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and I got a master's in environmental studies to learn a little bit more formally about the policy arena and economics, as well as the scientific aspects of these issues. And since then, for about the last 22 years, I have worked in a number of NGOs and government offices, both in D.C. and also I spent 8 years in New Mexico working on conservation issues there. I've been back in D.C. for the last 12 years and sort of jumped around a bit. I spent